Last year's football season for the University of Kansas was a disappointing one, to say the least, because this team had the potential to go to a bowl game and they didn't make it because of the amount of one-score losses they had. So that got me thinking, what if KU actually won those games that they lost by one score? But I decided to take it a little step further and go way back to 1999 to the present day and do that for every season. Now, for context, everything is going to be set in stone, so the hypothetical is going to be out the window. I will say that there's a chance that this would have happened, but it didn't in the real timeline. It doesn't happen in the alternate timeline. So yeah, without further ado, let's do it. Let's begin with 1999. For context, KU went 4-7 in 1998. And this year, a game was added, so KU went 5-7 this year. However, they had one score loss, meaning that in this alternate timeline, KU would be 6-6, making them bowl eligible for the first time since 1995. The team they would defeat would be Nebraska, meaning that the streak would have ended at 30 games rather than 36. In the year 2000, and if you don't get that reference, shame on you, Kansas went 4-7. They regressed from the year prior. However, they had one score loss, and that was to Texas Tech, meaning in this alternate timeline, KU would actually be 5-6, just missing out on a bowl game. 2001 was a difficult year for KU because, well, they were terrible, and then they fired their head coach Terry Allen 2/3 of the way through. Kansas finished the 0-1 season with a 3-8 record, and to make things worse, they didn't have a one-score loss, meaning that their 2001 record would remain unchanged at 3-8. 2002 would be the first year with Mark Mangino as head coach, and it went bad. Kansas went 2-10 in real life. However, they had one score loss, and that was to Baylor, meaning that in this alternate timeline, the first year under Mark Mangino would have a 3-9 campaign. 2003 would be a big year for KU, as it would be the first time the team was bowl eligible in 8 years. Kansas went 6-7 in real life. However, the Jayhawks would have 2 one-score losses, one to Northwestern and the other to Colorado, meaning that in this alternate timeline, Kansas would be 8-5, meaning that the Kansas Jayhawks would have their first winning season since 1999. 2004 would be a big what if for KU because KU regressed from 03 going 4-7. However, KU had not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 one-score losses. They would be to Northwestern, Texas Tech, Nebraska, Iowa State, and Texas, meaning that KU would be 9-2 in 2004. And if things were to change, Kansas would have been in the Big 12 title game against Oklahoma. Man, if things would have been different. 2005 would have been a sigh of relief for KU in real life, as KU would go 7-5 and win their first bowl game in 10 years. However, things wouldn't change for the alternate timeline, as KU didn't have a single one-score loss, meaning that their record would still be 7-5. 2006 should piss off a lot of KU fans because Kansas in real life were 6-6 and did not make a bowl game. Well, the alternate timeline said hold my beer because Kansas had 4 one-score losses. They were to Toledo, Nebraska, Texas A&M, and Baylor, meaning that Kansas in this alternate timeline would have been 10-2 and made the Big 12 championship game for the second time in 3 years. This one's pretty easy. 2007, Kansas went 12-1 and won the FedEx Orange Bowl. However, they had one score loss, and that was to Missouri, meaning in this alternate timeline, Kansas would be undefeated 13-0 and would have been in the Big 12 championship game for the second consecutive season and potentially could have gone to the national championship game if it only could have been. 2008 was a bit of a downgrade as Kansas went from 12-1 to an 8-5 Insight Bowl championship team. However, the Jayhawks had one one-score loss, and that was to USF, meaning that the Jayhawks in this alternate timeline would be 9-4, and most likely still Insight Bowl champions. 2009 would be considered as the beginning of the fall of Kansas football, as Kansas went from 8-5 to 5-7. However, things probably would have been different as Kansas had 3 one-score losses. They were to Colorado, Kansas State, and Missouri, meaning that in this alternate timeline, the 2009 Jayhawks would have been 8-4, meaning that their bowl streak would have continued to 7 consecutive seasons, and Mark Mangino's job probably would have been saved. 2010 would be the first year with Turner Gill as head coach, and it was a dumpster fire. Kansas regressed big time and finished with a record of 3-9. Yet, Kansas had one one-score loss, and that was to North Dakota State in the season opener. So in this alternate timeline, Kansas would finish the 2010 season with a record of 4-8. It was still a pretty bad season. 2011 was not much help. In fact, this would be Turner Gill's last year as Kansas football coach. KU regressed and finished with a record of 2-10 in real life. However, KU had 2 one-score losses this season, one to Iowa State and the other to Baylor. In this alternate timeline, the 2011 Jayhawks would finish with a record of 4-8. Now that I think about it, I think Turner Gill would still get fired after this season. 2012 is another big what if because this would be KU's first under Charlie Weis, and it was horrible. Kansas finished the 2012 campaign with a record of 1-11 in real life. However, KU had 5 one-score losses. They were to Rice, Northern Illinois, Oklahoma State, Texas, and Texas Tech, meaning that the Jayhawks in the alternate timeline would have been 6-6, making them bowl eligible for the first time since 2009. 2013 would be an improvement for KU as they improved from 1-11 to 3-9. However, things wouldn't have changed as KU had 0 one-score losses, so the 2013 Jayhawks would remain a 3-9 team. 2014 was an unfortunate year as Charlie Weis would get fired a third of the way through the season and Kansas would go to Clint Bowen. And Bowen did decent for the time being, and Kansas finished the 2014 campaign with a record of 3-9. However, with Clint Bowen as head coach, KU had 2 one-score losses. They were to Oklahoma State and TCU, meaning in this alternate timeline, Kansas would have been 5-7, just missing out on a bowl game again. You knew this was coming. The year 2015, in which Kansas finished the year winless, 0-12 with David Beatty as head coach. However, things would have been a little bit different in the alternate timeline, as Kansas had 2 one-score losses in 2015, one to South Dakota State and the other to TCU, meaning that the Jayhawks would be 2-10 in 2015. 2016 was an improvement in real life from 2015 as the Jayhawks went from winless to 2-10. However, things would have been different in the alternate timeline as Kansas had 2 one-score losses, one to TCU and the other to Iowa State, meaning that the 2016 Jayhawks in this alternate timeline would have been 4-8, and that probably would have gave David Beatty a contract extension. 2017 turned out to be a horrible one as the Jayhawks regressed, going from 2-10 to 1-11 in real life. And what makes it worse is that Kansas had 0 one-score losses in 2017, meaning that this team stays at 1-11. Spoiler alert, this would be the last season where Kansas didn't have a one-score loss. 2018 would be the last year where David Beatty is the head coach at the University of Kansas, and it turned out to be his best one. Kansas finished the 2018 campaign with a 3-9 record. However, things would have been different in the alternate timeline, as Kansas had 3 one-score losses, one to Nicholls, the other to K-State, and the last one to Texas, meaning that in this alternate timeline, Kansas would have been 6-6, becoming bowl eligible for the first time since 2012. That probably would have saved David Beatty's job if that was the case. 2019 would be similar to 2018, only with a new head coach, and that man would be Les Miles. Kansas finished the 2019 campaign 3-9 in real life, and the Jayhawks had 3 one-score losses this season. They were to Coastal Carolina, West Virginia, and Texas, meaning in this alternate timeline, Kansas would have been 6-6 and bowl eligible for the second consecutive season. Man, can we catch a break? The answer to that question would be a resounding no, as the 2020 season had to happen. Kansas had its second winless season in 6 years, going 0-9 in real life. The only saving grace is that Kansas had one-score loss, and that was to Texas Tech in the season finale. Meaning in the alternate timeline, Kansas would have been 1-8. And yeah, it probably still wouldn't have saved Les Miles' job. The year 2021, where the culture started to change a bit as Lance Leipold became the head coach at Kansas. In his first year, it was a struggle as the Jayhawks went 2-10. However, KU had 2 one-score losses to end the season. They were to TCU and West Virginia. Meaning in this alternate timeline, Lance Leipold's first year at Kansas would have had the team going 4-8. A lot better start than people would have expected. 2022 would be a big year for Kansas in real life, as the Jayhawks would go bowling for the first time since 2008. Kansas would go 6-7 in real life. However, things would have been different in the alternate timeline, as KU had 2 one-score losses. One to TCU and the other to Arkansas in the Liberty Bowl. That would mean in the alternate timeline, Kansas would have gone 8-5 and would have won the Liberty Bowl, which they probably would have gave Lance Leipold a statue by then. 2023 would be KU's most successful season since 2008 in real life, as Kansas went 9-4 and won the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. However, things would have been different had it been in this alternate timeline, because Kansas had 3 one-score losses. They were to Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, and Kansas State. In this alternate timeline, Kansas would have been 12-1 and would have made the Big 12 championship game against Texas. Man, if only KU could pull out those games in the fourth quarter, this would have been an amazing season. And the final season we're going to talk about in this video, the 2024 season. In this season, Kansas started their first 8 games with a record of 2-6. However, their final 4 games, Kansas went 3-1, finishing with the record of 5-7 in real life, just missing out on going bowling for the 3rd straight year. However, things would have been different if Kansas had won games that they lost by 1 score, because Kansas had 5 one-score losses. They were to Illinois, UNLV, West Virginia, Arizona State, and Kansas State, which means in this alternate timeline, Kansas would have been 10-2 and would have made the Big 12 championship game against Iowa State. And who knows, maybe Kansas would have won this game and went to the college football playoff for the first time in school history. If it only could have been. All right, that's going to do it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Also, don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and push that notification bell, and tell your friends about these videos. And I should see you again when the next one comes out. But until then, have a good day. Never ever bring exotic dancers to the field house. I'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.